Section 7 of More New Arabian Nights by Robert Louis Stevenson. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Don W. Jenkins. Story of the House with the Green Blinds. Francis Scrymgeour, a clerk of the Bank of Scotland at Edinburgh, had attained the age of 25 in a sphere of quiet, creditable, and domestic life. His mother died while he was young, but his father, a man of sense and probity, had given him an excellent education at school, and brought him up at home to orderly and frugal habits. Francis, who was of a docile and affectionate disposition, profited by these advantages with zeal, and devoted himself heart and soul to his employment. A walk upon Saturday afternoon, an occasional dinner with members of his family, and a yearly tour of a fortnight in the Highlands or even on the continent of Europe were his principal distractions, and he grew rapidly in favour with his superiors, and enjoyed already a salary of nearly £200 a year, with the prospect of an ultimate advance to almost double that amount. Few young men were more contented, few more willing and laborious than Francis Scrymgeour. Sometimes at night, when he had read the daily paper, he would play upon the flute to amuse his father, for whose qualities he entertained a great respect. One day he received a note from a well-known firm of writers to the Signet, requesting the favour of an immediate interview with him. The letter was marked private and confidential, and had been addressed to him at the bank instead of at home, two unusual circumstances which made him obey the summons with the more alacrity. The senior member of the firm, a man of much austerity of manner, made him gravely welcome, requested him to take a seat, and proceeded to explain the matter in hand in the picked expressions of a veteran man of business. A person who must remain nameless, but of whom the lawyer had every reason to think well, a man, in short, of some station in the country, desired to make Francis an annual allowance of £500. The capital was to be placed under the control of the lawyer's firm and two trustees, who must also remain anonymous. There were conditions annexed to this liberality, but he was of opinion that his new client would find nothing either excessive or dishonourable in the terms, and he repeated these two words with emphasis, as though he desired to commit himself to nothing more. Francis asked their nature. "The conditions," said the writer to the Signet, "are, as I have twice remarked, neither dishonourable nor excessive. At the same time, I cannot conceal from you that they are most unusual. Indeed, the whole case is very much out of our way, and I should certainly have refused it, had it not been for the reputation of the gentleman who entrusted it to my care. And let me add, Mr. Scrymgeour, the interest I have been led to take in yourself by many complimentary and, I have no doubt, well-deserved reports." Francis entreated him to be more specific. "You cannot picture my uneasiness as to these conditions," he said. "They are two," replied the lawyer, "only two, and the sum, as you will remember, is £500 a year, and unburdened. I forgot to add, unburdened." And the lawyer raised his eyebrows at him with solemn gusto. "The first," he resumed, "is of remarkable simplicity. You must be in Paris by the afternoon of Sunday the 15th. There you will find at the box office of the Comédie Française a ticket for admission taken in your name and waiting you. You are requested to sit out the whole performance in the seat provided, and that is all." "I should certainly have preferred a weekday," replied Francis, "but after all, once in a way—" "And in Paris, my dear sir," added the lawyer soothingly, "I believe I am something of a precisian myself, but upon such a consideration, and in Paris, I should not hesitate an instant." And the pair laughed pleasantly together. "The other is of more importance," continued the writer to the Signet. "It regards your marriage. My client, taking a deep interest in your welfare, desires to advise you absolutely in the choice of a wife. Absolutely, you understand," he repeated. "Let us be more explicit, if you please," returned Francis. "Am I to marry anyone, maid or widow, black or white, whom this invisible person chooses to propose?" "I was to assure you that the suitability of age and position should be a principle with your benefactor," replied the lawyer. As to race, I confess the difficulty had not occurred to me, and I failed to inquire. But if you like, I will make a note of it at once, and advise you on the earliest opportunity." "Sir," said Francis, "it remains to be seen whether this whole affair is not a most unworthy fraud. The circumstances are inexplicable, I had almost said incredible, and until I see a little more daylight and some plausible motive, I confess I should be very sorry to put a hand to the transaction. I appeal to you in this difficulty for information. I must learn what is at the bottom of it all. If you do not know, cannot guess, or not at liberty to tell me, I shall take my hat and go back to my bank as I came." "I do not know," answered the lawyer, "but I have an excellent guess. Your father, and no one else, is at the root of this apparently unnatural business." "My father!" cried Francis, in extreme disdain. "Worthy man! I know every thought of his mind, every penny of his fortune." "You misinterpret my words," said the lawyer. "I do not refer to Mr. Scrymgeour, senior, for he is not your father. When he and his wife came to Edinburgh, you were already nearly 1 year old, and you had not been 3 months in their care. The secret has been well kept, but such is the fact. Your father is unknown, and I say again that I believe him to be the original of the offers I am charged at present to transmit to you." It would be impossible to exaggerate the astonishment of Francis Scrymgeour at this unexpected information. He pled his confusion to the lawyer. "Sir," said he, "after a piece of news so startling, you must grant me some hours of thought. You shall know this evening what conclusion I have reached." The lawyer commended his prudence, and Francis, excusing himself upon some pretext at the bank, took a long walk into the country, and fully considered the different steps and aspects of the case. A pleasant sense of his own importance rendered him the more deliberate, but the issue was from the first not doubtful. His whole carnal man leaned irresistibly towards the 500 a year, and the strange conditions with which it was burdened. He discovered in his heart an invincible repugnance to the name of Scrymgeour, which he had never hitherto disliked. He began to despise the narrow and unromantic interests of his former life; and, when once his mind was fairly made up, he walked with a new feeling of strength and freedom, and nourished himself with the gayest anticipations. He said but a word to the lawyer, and immediately received a cheque for 2 quarters' arrears, for the allowance was antedated from the 1st of January. With this in his pocket he walked home. The flat in Scotland Street looked mean in his eyes. His nostrils, for the first time, rebelled against the odour of broth; and he observed little defects of manner in his adoptive father which filled him with surprise and almost with disgust. The next day, he determined, should see him on his way to Paris. In that city, where he arrived long before the appointed date, he put up at a modest hotel frequented by English and Italians, and devoted himself to improvement in the French tongue. For this purpose he had a master twice a week, entered into conversation with loiterers in the Champs Elysees, and nightly frequented the theatre. He had his whole toilette fashionably renewed, and was shaved and had his hair dressed every morning by a barber in a neighbouring street. This gave him something of a foreign air, and seemed to wipe off the reproach of his past years. At length, on the Saturday afternoon, he betook himself to the box office of the theatre in the Rue Richelieu. No sooner had he mentioned his name than the clerk produced the order in an envelope of which the address was scarcely dry. "It has been taken this moment," said the clerk. "Indeed," said Francis. "May I ask what the gentleman was like?" "Your friend is easy to describe," replied the official. "He is old and strong and beautiful, with white hair and a sabre cut across his face. You cannot fail to recognise so marked a person." "No, indeed," returned Francis, "and I thank you for your politeness." "He cannot be far distant," added the clerk. "If you make haste, you might still overtake him." Francis did not wait to be twice told. He ran precipitately from the theatre into the middle of the street, and looked in all directions. More than one white-haired man was within sight, but though he overtook each of them in succession, all wanted the sabre cut. For nearly half an hour he tried one street after another in the neighbourhood, until at length, recognising the folly of continued search, he started on a walk to compose his agitated feelings. For this proximity of an encounter with him to whom he could not doubt he owed the day had profoundly moved the young man. It chanced that his way led up the Rue Drouot, and thence up the Rue des Martyrs, and chance, in this case, served him better than all the forethought in the world. For on the outer boulevard he saw two men in earnest colloquy upon a seat. One was dark, young, and handsome, secularly dressed, but with an indelible clerical stamp. The other answered in every particular to the description given him by the clerk. Francis felt his heart beat high in his bosom. He knew he was now about to hear the voice of his father; and making a wide circuit, he noiselessly took his place behind the couple in question, who were too much interested in their talk to observe much else. As Francis had expected, the conversation was conducted in the English language. "Your suspicions begin to annoy me, Rolls," said the older man. "I tell you I am doing my utmost. A man cannot lay his hand on millions in a moment. Have I not taken you up, a mere stranger, out of pure goodwill? Are you not living largely on my bounty?" "On your advances, Mr. Vandeleur," corrected the other. "Advances if you choose, and interest instead of goodwill if you prefer it," returned Vandeleur angrily. "I am not here to pick expressions. Business is business, and your business, let me remind you, is too muddy for such airs. Trust me, or leave me alone and find someone else. But let us have an end, for God's sake, of your jeremiads." "I am beginning to learn the world," replied the other, "and I see that you have every reason to play me false, and not one to deal honestly. I am not here to pick expressions either. You wish the diamond for yourself. You know you do. You dare not deny it. Have you not already forged my name, and searched my lodging in my absence? I understand the cause of your delays. You are lying in wait. You are the diamond hunter, forsooth, and sooner or later, by fair means or foul, you'll lay your hands upon it. I tell you it must stop. Push me much further, and I promise you a surprise." "It does not become you to use such threats," returned Vandeleur. "Two can play at that. My brother is here in Paris, the police are on the alert, and if you persist in wearying me with your caterwauling, I will arrange a little astonishment for you, Mr. Rolls. But mine shall be once and for all. Do you understand, or would you prefer me to tell it you in Hebrew? There is an end to all things, and you have come to the end of my patience. Tuesday at 7, not a day, not an hour sooner, not the least part of a second, if it were to save your life. And if you do not choose to wait, you may go to the bottomless pit for me, and welcome." And so saying, the Dictator arose from the bench and marched off in the direction of Montmartre, shaking his head and swinging his cane with a most furious air, while his companion remained where he was in an attitude of great dejection. Francis was at the pitch of surprise and horror. His sentiments had been shocked to the last degree. The hopeful tenderness with which he had taken his place upon the bench was transformed into repulsion and despair. Old Mr. Scrymgeour, he reflected, was a far more kindly and creditable parent than this dangerous and violent intriguer; but he retained his presence of mind, and suffered not a moment to elapse before he was on the trail of the Dictator. That gentleman's fury carried him forward at a brisk pace, and he was so completely occupied in his angry thoughts that he never so much as cast a look behind him till he reached his own door. His house stood high up in the Rue Lepic, commanding a view of all Paris, and enjoying the pure air of the heights. It was 2 stories high, with green blinds and shutters, and all the windows looking on the street were hermetically closed. Tops of trees showed over the high garden wall, and the wall was protected by chevaux de frise. The Dictator paused a moment while he searched his pocket for a key, and then, opening a gate, disappeared within the enclosure. Francis looked about him. The neighbourhood was very lonely, the house isolated in its garden. It seemed as if his observation must here come to an abrupt end. A second glance, however, showed him a tall house next door, presenting a gable to the garden, and in this gable a single window. He passed to the front and saw a ticket offering unfurnished lodgings by the month; and, on inquiry, the room which commanded the Dictator's garden proved to be one of those to let. Francis did not hesitate a moment. He took the room, paid an advance upon the rent, and returned to his hotel to seek his baggage. The old man with the sabre cut might or might not be his father. He might or he might not be upon the true scent, but he was certainly on the edge of an exciting mystery, and he promised himself that he would not relax his observation until he had got to the bottom of the secret. From the window of his new apartment, Francis Scrymgeour commanded a complete view into the garden of the house with the green blinds. Immediately below him, a very comely chestnut with wide boughs sheltered a pair of rustic tables where people might dine in the height of summer. On all sides save one, a dense vegetation concealed the soil; but there, between the tables and the house, he saw a patch of gravel walk leading from the verandah to the garden gate. Studying the place from between the boards of the Venetian shutters, which he durst not open for fear of attracting attention, Francis observed but little to indicate the manners of the inhabitants, and that little argued no more than a close reserve and a taste for solitude. The garden was conventual. The house had the air of a prison. The green blinds were all drawn upon the outside. The door into the verandah was closed. The garden, as far as he could see it, was left entirely to itself in the evening sunshine. A modest curl of smoke from a single chimney alone testified to the presence of living people. In order that he might not be entirely idle, and to give a certain colour to his way of life, Francis had purchased Euclid's Geometry in French, which he set himself to copy and translate on the top of his portmanteau, and seated on the floor against the wall, for he was equally without chair or table. From time to time he would rise and cast a glance into the enclosure of the house with the green blinds; but the windows remained obstinately closed and the garden empty. Only late in the evening did anything occur to reward his continued attention. Between 9 and 10 the sharp tinkle of a bell aroused him from a fit of dozing, and he sprang to his observatory in time to hear an important noise of locks being opened and bars removed, and to see Mr. Vandeleur, carrying a lantern and clothed in a flowing robe of black velvet with a skull cap to match, issue from under the verandah and proceed leisurely towards the garden gate. The sound of bolts and bars was then repeated, and a moment after Francis perceived the Dictator escorting into the house, in the mobile light of the lantern, an individual of the lowest and most despicable appearance. Half an hour afterwards the visitor was reconducted to the street, and Mr. Vandeleur, setting his light upon one of the rustic tables, finished a cigar with great deliberation under the foliage of the chestnut. Francis, peering through a clear space among the leaves, was able to follow his gestures as he threw away the ash or enjoyed a copious inhalation, and beheld a cloud upon the old man's brow and a forcible action of the lips which testified to some deep and probably painful train of thought. The cigar was already almost at an end, when the voice of a young girl was heard suddenly crying the hour from the interior of the house. "In a moment," replied John Vandeleur. And with that he threw away the stump, and taking up the lantern, sailed away under the verandah for the night. As soon as the door was closed, absolute darkness fell upon the house. Francis might try his eyesight as much as he pleased; he could not detect so much as below a blind, and he concluded with great good sense that the bed chambers were all upon the other side. Early the next morning, for he was early awake after an uncomfortable night upon the floor, he saw cause to adopt a different explanation. The blinds rose, one after another, by means of a spring in the interior, and disclosed steel shutters such as we see on the front of shops. These, in their turn, were rolled up by a similar contrivance, and for the space of about an hour the chambers were left open to the morning air. At the end of that time, Mr. Vandeleur, with his own hand, once more closed the shutters and replaced the blinds from within. While Francis was still marvelling at these precautions, the door opened and a young girl came forth to look about her in the garden. It was not 2 minutes before she re-entered the house, but even in that short time he saw enough to convince him that she possessed the most unusual attractions. His curiosity was not only highly excited by this incident, but his spirits were improved to a still more notable degree. The alarming manners and more than equivocal life of his father ceased from that moment to prey upon his mind. From that moment he embraced his new family with ardour; and whether the young lady should prove his sister or his wife, he felt convinced she was an angel in disguise. So much was this the case, that he was seized with a sudden horror when he reflected how little he really knew, and how possible it was that he had followed the wrong person when he followed Mr. Vandeleur. The porter whom he consulted could afford him little information; but, such as it was, it had a mysterious and questionable sound. The person next door was an English gentleman of extraordinary wealth, and proportionately eccentric in his tastes and habits. He possessed great collections, which he kept in the house beside him; and it was to protect these that he had fitted the place with steel shutters, elaborate fastenings, and chevaux de frise along the garden wall. He lived much alone, in spite of some strange visitors with whom, it seemed, he had business to transact; and there was no one else in the house except Mademoiselle and an old woman servant. "Is Mademoiselle his daughter?" inquired Francis.
"Certainly," replied the porter. "Mademoiselle is the daughter of the house, and strange it is to see how she is made to work. For all his riches, it is she who goes to market, and every day in the week you may see her going by with a basket on her arm."
"And the collections?" asked the other.
"Sir," said the man, "they are immensely valuable. More I cannot tell you. Since Monsieur de Vandeleur's arrival, no one in the quarter has so much as passed the door."
"Suppose not," returned Francis. "You must surely have some notion what these famous galleries contain. Is it pictures, silks, statues, jewels, or what?"
"My faith, sir," said the fellow with a shrug, "it might be carrots, and still I could not tell you. How should I know? The house is kept like a garrison, as you perceive."
And then, as Francis was returning disappointed to his room, the porter called him back.
"I have just remembered, sir," said he. "Monsieur de Vandeleur has been in all parts of the world, and I once heard the old woman declare that he had brought many diamonds back with him. If that be the truth, there must be a fine show behind those shutters."
By an early hour on Sunday, Francis was in his place at the theatre. The seat which had been taken for him was only 2 or 3 numbers from the left-hand side, and directly opposite one of the lower boxes. As the seat had been specially chosen, there was doubtless something to be learned from its position; and he judged by an instinct that the box upon his right was, in some way or other, to be connected with the drama in which he ignorantly played a part. Indeed, it was so situated that its occupants could safely observe him from beginning to end of the piece, if they were so minded; while, profiting by the depth, they could screen themselves sufficiently well from any counter-examination on his side. He promised himself not to leave it for a moment out of sight; and whilst he scanned the rest of the theatre, or made a show of attending to the business of the stage, he always kept a corner of an eye upon the empty box. The second act had been some time in progress, and was even drawing towards a close, when the door opened and 2 persons entered and ensconced themselves in the darkest of the shade. Francis could hardly control his emotion. It was Mr. Vandeleur and his daughter. The blood came and went in his arteries and veins with stunning activity. His ears sang, his head turned. He dared not look lest he should awake suspicion. His playbill, which he kept reading from end to end and over again, turned from white to red before his eyes; and when he cast a glance upon the stage, it seemed incalculably far away, and he found the voices and gestures of the actors to the last degree impertinent and absurd. From time to time he risked a momentary look in the direction which principally interested him; and once at least he felt certain that his eyes encountered those of the young girl. A shock passed over his body, and he saw all the colours of the rainbow. What would he not have given to overhear what passed between the Vandeleurs? What would he not have given for the courage to take up his opera-glass and steadily inspect their attitude and expression? There, for aught he knew, his whole life was being decided, and he not able to interfere, not able even to follow the debate, but condemned to sit and suffer where he was, in impotent anxiety. The curtain fell, and the people around him began to leave their places for the interval. It was only natural that he should follow their example, and if he did so, it was not only natural but necessary that he should pass immediately in front of the box in question. Summoning all his courage, but keeping his eyes lowered, Francis drew near the spot. His progress was slow, for the old gentleman before him moved with incredible deliberation, wheezing as he went. What was he to do? Should he address the Vandeleurs by name as he went by? Should he take the flower from his buttonhole and throw it into the box? Should he raise his face and direct one long and affectionate look upon the lady who was either his sister or his betrothed? As he found himself thus struggling among so many alternatives, he had a vision of his old equable existence in the bank, and was assailed by a thought of regret for the past. By this time he had arrived directly opposite the box, and although he was still undetermined what to do, or whether to do anything, he turned his head and lifted his eyes. No sooner had he done so than he uttered a cry of disappointment, and remained rooted to the spot. The box was empty. During his slow advance, Mr. Vandeleur and his daughter had quietly slipped away. A polite person in his rear reminded him that he was stopping the path, and he moved on again with mechanical footsteps, and suffered the crowd to carry him unresisting out of the theatre. Once in the street, the pressure ceasing, he came to a halt, and the cool night air speedily restored him to the possession of his faculties. He was surprised to find that his head ached violently, and that he remembered not one word of the two acts which he had witnessed. As the excitement wore away, it was succeeded by an overweening appetite for sleep, and he hailed a cab, and drove to his lodging in a state of extreme exhaustion and some disgust of life. Next morning he lay in wait for Miss Vandeleur on her road to market, and by 8 o'clock beheld her stepping down a lane. She was simply and even poorly attired, but in the carriage of her head and body there was something flexible and noble that would have lent distinction to the meanest toilette. Even her basket, so aptly did she carry it, became her like an ornament. It seemed to Francis, as he slipped into a doorway, that the sunshine followed, and the shadows fled before her as she walked, and he was conscious for the first time of a bird singing in a cage above the lane. He suffered her to pass the doorway, and then, coming forth once more, addressed her by name from behind. "Miss Vandeleur," said he. She turned, and when she saw who he was, became deadly pale. "Pardon me," he continued. "Heaven knows I had no will to startle you, and indeed there should be nothing startling in the presence of one who wishes you so well as I do. And believe me, I am acting rather from necessity than choice. We have many things in common, and I am sadly in the dark. There is much that I should be doing, and my hands are tied. I do not know even what to feel, or who are my friends and enemies." She found her voice with an effort. "I do not know who you are," she said. "Ah, yes, Miss Vandeleur, you do," returned Francis, "better than I do myself. Indeed, it is on that, above all, that I seek light. Tell me what you know," he pleaded. "Tell me who I am, who you are, and how our destinies are intermixed. Give me a little help with my life, Miss Vandeleur. Only a word or two to guide me. Only the name of my father, if you will, and I shall be grateful and content." "I will not attempt to deceive you," she replied. "I know who you are, but I am not at liberty to say." "Tell me at least that you have forgiven my presumption, and I shall wait with all the patience I have," he said. "If I am not to know, I must do without. It is cruel, but I can bear more upon a push. Only do not add to my troubles the thought that I have made an enemy of you." "You did only what was natural," she said, "and I have nothing to forgive you. Farewell." "Is it to be farewell?" he asked. "Nay, that I do not know myself," she answered. "Farewell for the present, if you like." And with these words she was gone. Francis returned to his lodging in a state of considerable commotion of mind. He made the most trifling progress with his Euclid for that forenoon, and was more often at the window than at his improvised writing table. But beyond seeing the return of Miss Vandeleur, and the meeting between her and her father, who was smoking a Trichinopoly cigar in the verandah, there was nothing notable in the neighbourhood of the house with the green blinds before the time of the midday meal. The young man hastily allayed his appetite in a neighbouring restaurant, and returned with the speed of unallayed curiosity to the house in Rue Lepic. A mounted servant was leading a saddle horse to and fro before the garden wall, and the porter of Francis's lodging was smoking a pipe against the doorpost, absorbed in contemplation of the livery and the steeds. "Look!" he cried to the young man. "What fine cattle! What an elegant costume! They belong to the brother of Monsieur de Vandeleur, who is now within upon a visit. He is a great man, a general in your country, and you doubtless know him well by reputation."
"I confess," returned Francis, "that I have never heard of General Vandeleur before. We have many officers of that grade, and my pursuits have been exclusively civil."
"It is he," replied the porter, "who lost the great diamond of the Indies. Of that at least you must have read often in the papers."
As soon as Francis could disengage himself from the porter, he ran upstairs and hurried to the window. Immediately below the clear space in the chestnut trees, the two gentlemen were seated in conversation over a cigar. The General, a red military-looking man, offered some traces of a family resemblance to his brother. He had something of the same features, something, although very little, of the same free and powerful carriage. But he was older, smaller, and more common in air. His likeness was that of a caricature, and he seemed altogether a poor and debile being by the side of the Dictator. They spoke in tones so low, leaning over the table with every appearance of interest, that Francis could catch no more than a word or two on an occasion. For as little as he heard, he was convinced that the conversation turned upon himself and his own career. Several times the name of Scrymgeour reached his ear, for it was easy to distinguish, and still more frequently he fancied he could distinguish the name Francis. At length the General, as if in a hot anger, broke forth into several violent exclamations.
"Francis Vandeleur!" he cried, accentuating the last word. "Francis Vandeleur, I tell you!"
The Dictator made a movement of his whole body, half affirmative, half contemptuous, but his answer was inaudible to the young man. Was he the Francis Vandeleur in question, he wondered? Were they discussing the name under which he was to be married? Or was the whole affair a dream and a delusion of his own conceit and self-absorption? After another interval of inaudible talk, dissension seemed again to arise between the couple underneath the chestnut, and again the General raised his voice angrily so as to be audible to Francis.
"My wife?" he cried. "I have done with my wife for good. I will not hear her name. I am sick of her very name." And he swore aloud and beat the table with his fist. The Dictator appeared by his gestures to pacify him after a paternal fashion, and a little after he conducted him to the garden gate. The pair shook hands affectionately enough, but as soon as the door had closed behind his visitor, John Vandeleur fell into a fit of laughter, which sounded unkindly and even devilish in the ears of Francis Scrymgeour. So another day had passed, and little more learnt. But the young man remembered that the morrow was Tuesday, and promised himself some curious discoveries. All might be well, or all might be ill. He was sure at least to glean some curious information, and perhaps by good luck to get at the heart of the mystery which surrounded his father and his family. As the hour of the dinner drew near, many preparations were made in the garden of the house with the green blinds. The table, which was partly visible to Francis through the chestnut leaves, was destined to serve as a sideboard, and carried relays of plates and the materials for salad. The other, which was almost entirely concealed, had been set apart for the diners, and Francis could catch glimpses of white cloth and silver plate. Mr. Rolles arrived, punctual to the minute. He looked like a man upon his guard, and spoke low and sparingly. The Dictator, on the other hand, appeared to enjoy an unusual flow of spirits. His laugh, which was youthful and pleasant to hear, sounded frequently from the garden. By the modulation and changes of his voice, it was obvious that he told many droll stories and imitated the accents of a variety of different nations. And before he and the young clergyman had finished their vermouth, all feeling of distrust was at an end, and they were talking together like a pair of school companions. At length Miss Vandeleur made her appearance, carrying the soup tureen. Mr. Rolles ran to offer her assistance, which she laughingly refused; and there was an interchange of pleasantries among the trio which seemed to have reference to this primitive manner of waiting by one of the company.
"One is more at one's ease," Mr. Vandeleur was heard to declare.
Next moment they were all three in their places, and Francis could see as little as he could hear of what passed. but the dinner seemed to go merrily. There was a perpetual babble of voices and sound of knives and forks below the chestnut; and Francis, who had no more than a roll to gnaw, was affected with envy by the comfort and deliberation of the meal. The party lingered over one dish after another, and then over a delicate dessert, with a bottle of old wine carefully uncorked by the hand of the Dictator himself. As it began to grow dark, a lamp was set upon the table and a couple of candles on the sideboard, for the night was perfectly pure, starry, and windless. Light overflowed, besides, from the door and window of the verandah, so that the garden was fully illuminated and the leaves twinkled in the darkness. For perhaps the 10th time Miss Vandeleur entered the house, and on this occasion she returned with the coffee tray, which she placed upon the sideboard. At the same moment her father rose from his seat. "The coffee is my province," Francis heard him say; and the next moment he saw his supposed father standing by the sideboard in the light of the candles. Talking over his shoulder all the while, Mr. Vandeleur poured out 2 cups of the brown stimulant, and then, by a rapid act of prestidigitation, emptied the contents of a tiny phial into the smaller of the 2. The thing was so swiftly done that even Francis, who looked straight into his face, had hardly time to perceive the movement before it was completed. And next instant, and still laughing, Mr. Vandeleur had turned again towards the table with a cup in either hand. "Ere we have done with this," said he, "we may expect our famous Hebrew." It would be impossible to depict the confusion and distress of Francis Scrymgeour. He saw foul play going forward before his eyes, and he felt bound to interfere, but he knew not how. It might be a mere pleasantry, and then how should he look if he were to offer an unnecessary warning? Or again, if it were serious, the criminal might be his own father, and then how should he not lament if he were to bring ruin on the author of his days? For the first time he became conscious of his own position as a spy. To wait inactive at such a juncture, and with such a conflict of sentiments in his bosom, was to suffer the most acute torture. He clung to the bars of the shutters. His heart beat fast with irregularity, and he felt a strong sweat break forth upon his body. Several minutes passed. He seemed to perceive the conversation die away and grow less and less in vivacity and volume, but still no sign of any alarming or even notable event. Suddenly the ring of a glass breaking was followed by a faint and dull sound, as of a person who should have fallen forward with his head upon the table. At the same moment a piercing scream rose from the garden. "What have you done?" cried Miss Vandeleur. "He is dead!" The Dictator replied in a violent whisper, so strong and sibilant that every word was audible to the watcher in the window. "Silence!" said Mr. Vandeleur. "The man is as well as I am. Take him by the heels, whilst I carry him by the shoulders." Francis heard Miss Vandeleur break forth into a passion of tears. "Do you hear what I say?" resumed the Dictator in the same tones. "Or do you wish to quarrel with me? I give you your choice, Miss Vandeleur." There was another pause, and the Dictator spoke again. "Take that man by the heels," he said. "I must have him brought into the house. If I were a little younger, I could help myself against the world. But now that years and dangers are upon me, and my hands are weakened, I must turn to you for aid." "It is a crime," replied the girl. "I am your father," said Mr. Vandeleur. The appeal seemed to produce its effect. A scuffling noise followed upon the gravel, a chair was overset, and then Francis saw the father and daughter stagger across the walk and disappear under the verandah, bearing the inanimate body of Mr. Rolles embraced about the knees and shoulders. The young clergyman was limp and pallid, and his head rolled upon his shoulders at every step. Was he alive or dead? Francis, in spite of the Dictator's declaration, inclined to the latter view. A great crime had been committed, a great calamity had fallen upon the inhabitants of the house with the green blinds. To his surprise, Francis found all horror for the deed swallowed up in sorrow for a girl and an old man whom he judged to be in the height of peril. A tide of generous feeling swept into his heart. He, too, would help his father against man and mankind, against fate and injustice, and casting open the shutters, he closed his eyes and threw himself with outstretched arms into the foliage of the chestnut. Branch after branch slipped from his grasp or broke under his weight, and he caught a stalwart bough under his armpit, and hung suspended for a moment, and then he let himself drop and fell heavily against the table. A cry of alarm from the house warned him that his entrance had not been effected unobserved. He recovered himself with a stagger, and in 3 bounds crossed the intervening space and stood before the door of the verandah. In a small apartment, carpeted with matting and surrounded by glazed cabinets full of rare and costly curios, Mr. Vandeleur was stooping over the body of Mr. Rolles. He raised himself as Francis entered, and there was an instantaneous passage of hands. It was the business of a second. As fast as an eye could wink, the thing was done. The young man had not the time to be sure, but it seemed to him as if the Dictator had taken something from the curate's breast, looked at it for the least fraction of time as it lay in his hand, and then suddenly, swiftly passed it to his daughter. All this was over while Francis had still one foot upon the threshold and the other raised in the air. The next instant he was on his knees to Mr. Vandeleur. "Father," he cried, "let me help you too. I will do what you wish and ask no questions. I will obey you with my life. Treat me as a son, and you will find I have a son's devotion." A deplorable explosion of oaths was the Dictator's first reply. "Son and father!" he cried. "Father and son! What damned natural comedy is all this? How do you come in my garden? What do you want? And who in God's name are you?" Francis, with a stunned and shamefaced aspect, got upon his feet again and stood in silence. Then a light seemed to break upon Mr. Vandeleur, and he laughed aloud. "I see," cried he. "It is Scrymgeour. Very well, Mr. Scrymgeour. Let me tell you in a few words how you stand. You have entered my private residence by force, or perhaps by fraud, but certainly with no encouragement from me, and you come at a moment of some annoyance, a guest having fainted at my table, to besiege me with your protestations. You are no son of mine. You are my brother's bastard by a fishwife, if you want to know. I regard you with an indifference closely bordering on aversion, and from what I see of your conduct, I judge your mind to be exactly suitable to your exterior. I recommend you these mortifying reflections for your leisure, and in the meantime let me beseech you to rid us of your presence. If I were not occupied," added the Dictator with a terrifying oath, "I should give you the unholiest drubbing ere you went." Francis listened in profound humiliation. He would have fled had it been possible, but as he had no means of leaving the residence into which he had so unfortunately penetrated, he could do no more than stand foolishly where he was. It was Miss Vandeleur who broke the silence. "Father," she said, "you speak in anger. Mr. Scrymgeour may have been mistaken, but he meant well and kindly." "Thank you for speaking," returned the Dictator. "You remind me of some other observations which I hold it a point of honour to make to Mr. Scrymgeour. My brother," he continued, addressing the young man, "has been foolish enough to give you an allowance. He was foolish enough and presumptuous enough to propose a match between you and this young lady. You were exhibited to her 2 nights ago, and I rejoice to tell you that she rejected the idea with disgust. Let me add that I have considerable influence with your father, and it shall not be my fault if you are not beggared of your allowance and sent back to your scrivening ere the week be out." The tones of the old man's voice were, if possible, more wounding than his language. Francis felt himself exposed to the most cruel, blighting, and unbearable contempt. His head turned, and he covered his face with his hands, uttering at the same time a tearless sob of agony. But Miss Vandeleur again interfered on his behalf. "Mr. Scrymgeour," she said, speaking in clear and even tones, "you must not be concerned at my father's harsh expressions. I felt no disgust for you. On the contrary, I asked an opportunity to make your better acquaintance. As for what has passed to-night, believe me, it has filled my mind with both pity and esteem." Just then Mr. Rolles made a convulsive movement with his arm, which convinced Francis that he was only drugged, and was beginning to throw off the influence of the opiate. Mr. Vandeleur stooped over him and examined his face for an instant. "Come, come," cried he, raising his head. "Let there be an end of this. And since you are so pleased with his conduct, Miss Vandeleur, take a candle and show the bastard out." The young lady hastened to obey. "Thank you," said Francis, as soon as he was alone with her in the garden. "I thank you from my soul. This has been the bitterest evening of my life, but it will have always one pleasant recollection." "I spoke as I felt," she replied, "and in justice to you. It made my heart sorry that you should be so unkindly used." By this time they had reached the garden gate, and Miss Vandeleur, having set the candle on the ground, was already unfastening the bolts.
"One word more," said Francis. "This is not for the last time. I shall see you again, shall I not?" "Alas," she answered, "you have heard my father. What can I do but obey?" "Tell me at least that it is not with your consent," returned Francis. "Tell me that you have no wish to see the last of me." "Indeed," replied she, "I have none. You seem to me both brave and honest." "Then," said Francis, "give me a keepsake." She paused for a moment, with her hand upon the key; for the various bars and bolts were all undone, and there was nothing left but to open the lock. "If I agree," she said, "will you promise to do as I tell you from point to point?" "Can you ask?" replied Francis. "I would do so willingly on your bare word." She turned the key and threw open the door. "Be it so," said she. "You do not know what you ask, but be it so. Whatever you hear," she continued, "whatever happens, do not return to this house. Hurry fast until you reach the lighted and populous quarters of the city. Even there be upon your guard. You are in a greater danger than you fancy. Promise me you will not so much as look at my keepsake until you are in a place of safety." "I promise," replied Francis. She put something loosely wrapped in a handkerchief into the young man's hand, and at the same time, with more strength than he could have anticipated, she pushed him into the street. "Now run!" she cried. He heard the door closed behind him and the noise of the bolts being replaced. "My faith," said he, "since I have promised." And he took to his heels down the lane that leads into the Rue Ravignan. He was not 50 paces from the house with the green blinds when the most diabolical outcry suddenly arose out of the stillness of the night. Mechanically he stood still. Another passenger followed his example. In the neighbouring floors he saw people crowding to the windows. A conflagration could not have produced more disturbance in this empty quarter. And yet it seemed to be all the work of a single man, roaring between grief and rage, like a lioness robbed of her whelps; and Francis was surprised and alarmed to hear his own name shouted with English imprecations to the wind. His first movement was to return to the house. His second, as he remembered Miss Vandeleur's advice, was to continue his flight with greater expedition than before. And he was in the act of turning to put his thought in action when the Dictator, bareheaded, bawling aloud, his white hair blowing about his head, shot past him like a ball out of the cannon's mouth and went careering down the street. "That was a close shave," thought Francis to himself. "What he wants with me, and why he should be so disturbed, I cannot think. But he is plainly not good company for the moment, and I cannot do better than follow Miss Vandeleur's advice." So saying, he turned to retrace his steps, thinking to double and descend by the Rue Lepic himself, while his pursuer should continue to follow after him on the other line of street. The plan was ill-devised. As a matter of fact, he should have taken his seat in the nearest café and waited there until the first heat of the pursuit was over. But besides that, Francis had no experience and little natural aptitude for the small war of private life. He was so unconscious of any evil on his part, that he saw nothing to fear beyond a disagreeable interview. And to disagreeable interviews he felt he had already served his apprenticeship that evening. Nor could he suppose that Miss Vandeleur had left anything unsaid. Indeed, the young man was sore both in body and mind. The one was all bruised, the other was full of smarting arrows, and he owned to himself that Mr. Vandeleur was a master of a very deadly tongue. The thought of his bruises reminded him that he had not only come without a hat, but that his clothes had considerably suffered in his descent through the chestnut. At the first magazine he purchased a cheap wideawake, and had the disorder of his toilet summarily repaired. The keepsake, still rolled in the handkerchief, he thrust in the meanwhile into his trousers pocket. Not many steps beyond the shop he was conscious of a sudden shock, a hand upon his throat, an infuriated face close to his own, and an open mouth bawling curses in his ear. The Dictator, having found no trace of his quarry, was returning by the other way. Francis was a stalwart young fellow, but he was no match for his adversary, whether in strength or skill, and after a few ineffectual struggles he resigned himself entirely to his captor. "What do you want with me?" said he. "We will talk of that at home," returned the Dictator grimly. And he continued to march the young man uphill in the direction of the house with the green blinds. But Francis, although he no longer struggled, was only waiting an opportunity to make a bold push for freedom.
With a sudden jerk, he left the collar of his coat in the hands of Mr. Vandeleur, and once more made off at his best speed in the direction of the boulevards. The tables were now turned. If the Dictator was the stronger, Francis, in the top of his youth, was the more fleet of foot, and he had soon effected his escape among the crowds. Relieved for a moment, but with a growing sentiment of alarm and wonder in his mind, he walked briskly until he debouched upon the Place de l'Opéra, lit up like day with electric lamps.
This at least, thought he, should satisfy Miss Vandeleur.
And turning to his right along the boulevards, he entered the Café Américain and ordered some beer. It was both late and early for the majority of the frequenters of the establishment. Only 2 or 3 persons, all men, were dotted here and there at separate tables in the hall, and Francis was too much occupied by his own thoughts to observe their presence. He drew the handkerchief from his pocket. The object wrapped in it proved to be a morocco case clasped and ornamented in gilt, which opened by means of a spring and disclosed to the horrified young man a diamond of monstrous bigness and extraordinary brilliancy. The circumstance was so inexplicable, the value of the stone was plainly so enormous, that Francis sat staring into the open casket without movement, without conscious thought, like a man stricken suddenly with idiocy. A hand was laid upon his shoulder, lightly but firmly, and a quiet voice, which yet had in it the ring of command, uttered these words in his ear: "Close the casket and compose your face." Looking up, he beheld a man still young, of an urbane and tranquil presence, and dressed with rich simplicity. This personage had risen from a neighbouring table, and bringing his glass with him, had taken a seat beside Francis. "Close the casket," repeated the stranger, "and put it quietly back into your pocket, where I feel persuaded it should never have been. Try, if you please, to throw off your bewildered air, and act as though I were one of your acquaintances whom you had met by chance. So, touch glasses with me. That is better. I fear, sir, you must be an amateur." And the stranger pronounced these last words with a smile of peculiar meaning, leaned back in his seat, and enjoyed a deep inhalation of tobacco.
"For God's sake," said Francis, "tell me who you are, and what this means. Why I should obey your most unusual suggestions, I am sure I know not. But the truth is, I have fallen this evening into so many perplexing adventures, and all I meet conduct themselves so strangely, that I think I must either have gone mad or wandered into another planet. Your face inspires me with confidence. You seem wise, good, and experienced. Tell me, for heaven's sake, why you accost me in so odd a fashion."
"All in due time," replied the stranger. "But I have the first hand, and you must begin by telling me how the Rajah's Diamond is in your possession."
"The Rajah's Diamond!" echoed Francis.
"I would not speak so loud if I were you," returned the other. "But most certainly you have the Rajah's Diamond in your pocket. I have seen and handled it a score of times in Sir Thomas Vandeleur's collection."
"Sir Thomas Vandeleur? The General? My father?" cried Francis.
"Your father?" repeated the stranger. "I was not aware the General had any family."
"I am illegitimate, sir," replied
Francis with a flush. The other bowed with gravity. It was a respectful bow, as of a man silently apologising to his equal; and Francis felt relieved and comforted, he scarce knew why. The society of this person did him good. He seemed to touch firm ground, a strong feeling of respect grew up in his bosom, and mechanically he removed his wideawake, as though in the presence of a superior. "I perceive," said the stranger, "that your adventures have not all been peaceful. Your collar is torn, your face is scratched, you have a cut upon your temple. You will, perhaps, pardon my curiosity when I ask you to explain how you came by these injuries, and how you happen to have stolen property to an enormous value in your pocket."
"I must differ from you," returned Francis hotly. "I possess no stolen property; and if you refer to the diamond, it was given to me not an hour ago by Miss Vandeleur in the Rue Lepic."
"By Miss Vandeleur of the Rue Lepic?" repeated the other. "You interest me more than you suppose. Pray continue."
"Heavens!" cried Francis. His memory had made a sudden bound. He had seen Mr. Vandeleur take an article from the breast of his drugged visitor, and that article, he was now persuaded, was a morocco case.
"You have a light?" inquired the stranger.
"Listen," replied Francis. I know not who you are, but I believe you to be worthy of confidence and helpful. I find myself in strange waters. I must have counsel and support, and since you invite me, I shall tell you all." And he briefly recounted his experiences since the day when he was summoned from the bank by his lawyer. "Yours is indeed a remarkable history," said the stranger, after the young man had made an end of his narrative, "and your position is full of difficulty and peril. Many would counsel you to seek out your father and give the diamond to him, but I have other views. Waiter!" he cried. The waiter drew near. "Will you ask the manager to speak with me a moment?" said he; and Francis observed once more, both in his tone and manner, the evidence of a habit of command. The waiter withdrew and returned in a moment with manager, who bowed with obsequious respect.
"What," said he, "can I do to serve you?"
"Have the goodness," replied the stranger, indicating Francis, "to tell this gentleman my name."
"You'll have the honour, sir," said the functionary, addressing young Scrymgeour, "to occupy the same table with His Highness Prince Florizel of Bohemia."
Francis rose with precipitation and made a grateful reverence to the Prince, who bade him resume his seat. "I thank you," said Florizel, once more addressing the functionary. "I am sorry to have deranged you for so small a matter." And he dismissed him with a movement of his hand. "And now," added the Prince, turning to Francis, "give me the diamond." Without a word, the casket was handed over. "You have done right," said Florizel. "Your sentiments have properly inspired you, and you will live to be grateful for the misfortunes of to-night. A man, Mr. Scrymgeour, may fall into 1,000 perplexities, but if his heart be upright and his intelligence unclouded, he will issue from them all without dishonour. Let your mind be at rest. Your affairs are in my hand, and with the aid of Heaven I am strong enough to bring them to a good end. Follow me, if you please, to my carriage." So saying, the Prince arose, and, having left a piece of gold for the waiter, conducted the young man from the café along the boulevard to where an unpretentious brougham and a couple of servants out of livery awaited his arrival. "This carriage," said he, "is at your disposal. Collect your baggage as rapidly as you can make it convenient, and my servants will conduct you to a villa in the neighbourhood of Paris, where you can await in some degree of comfort until I have had time to arrange your situation. You will find there a pleasant garden, a library of good authors, a cook, a cellar, and some good cigars, which I recommend to your attention. Jérôme," he added, turning to one of the servants, "you have heard what I say. I leave Mr. Scrymgeour in your charge. You will, I know, be careful of my friend." Francis uttered some broken phrases of gratitude. "It will be time enough to thank me," said the Prince, "when you are acknowledged by your father and married to Miss Vandeleur." And with that the Prince turned away and strolled leisurely in the direction of Montmartre. He hailed the first passing cab, gave an address, and a quarter of an hour afterwards, having discharged the driver some distance lower, he was knocking at Mr. Vandeleur's garden gate. It was opened with singular precautions by the Dictator in person. "Who are you?" he demanded. "You must pardon me this late visit, Mr. Vandeleur," replied the Prince. "Your Highness is always welcome," returned Mr. Vandeleur, stepping back. The Prince profited by the open space, and without waiting for his host, walked right into the house and opened the door of the salon. Two people were seated there. One was Miss Vandeleur, who bore the marks of weeping about her eyes and was still shaken from time to time by a sob. On the other, the Prince recognised the young man who had consulted him on literary matters about a month before in a club smoking room. "Good evening, Miss Vandeleur," said Florizel. "You look fatigued. Mr. Rolls, I believe? I hope you have profited by the study of Gaboriau, Mr. Rolls?" But the young clergyman's temper was too much embittered for speech, and he contented himself with bowing stiffly, and continued to gnaw his lip. "To what good wind," said Mr. Vandeleur, following his guest, "am I to attribute the honour of your Highness's presence?" "I am come on business," returned the Prince. "On business with you. As soon as that is settled, I shall request Mr. Rolls to accompany me for a walk. Mr. Rolls," he added with severity, "let me remind you that I have not yet sat down." The clergyman sprang to his feet with an apology, whereupon the Prince took an armchair beside the table, handed his hat to Mr. Vandeleur, his cane to Mr. Rolls, and leaving them standing and thus menially employed upon his service, spoke as follows. I have come here, as I said, upon business. But had I come looking for pleasure, I could not have been more displeased with my reception, nor more dissatisfied with my company. You, sir," addressing Mr. Rolls, "you have treated your superior in station with discourtesy. You, Vandeleur, receive me with a smile, but you know right well that your hands are not yet cleansed from misconduct. I do not desire to be interrupted, sir," he added imperiously. "I am here to speak and not to listen. And I have to ask you to hear me with respect and to obey punctiliously. At the earliest possible date, your daughter shall be married at the Embassy to my friend Francis Scrymgeour, your brother's acknowledged son. You will oblige me by offering not less than £10,000 dowry. For yourself, I will indicate to you in writing a mission of some importance in Siam, which I destine to your care. And now, sir, you will answer me in 2 words whether or not you agree to these conditions." "Your Highness will pardon me," said Mr. Vandeleur, "and permit me with all respect to submit to him 2 queries?" "The permission is granted," replied the Prince. "Your Highness," resumed the Dictator, "has called Mr. Scrymgeour his friend. Believe me, had I known he was thus honoured, I should have treated him with proportional respect." "You interrogate adroitly," said the Prince, "but it will not serve your turn. You have my commands. If I had never seen that gentleman before tonight, it would not render them less absolute." "Your Highness interprets my meaning with his usual subtlety," returned Vandeleur. "Once more, I have unfortunately put the police upon the track of Mr. Scrymgeour on a charge of theft. Am I to withdraw or to uphold the accusation?" "You will please yourself," replied Florizel. "The question is one between your conscience and the laws of this land. Give me my hat, and you, Mr. Rolls, give me my cane and follow me. Miss Vandeleur, I wish you good evening. I judge," he added to Vandeleur, "that your silence means unqualified assent." "If I can do no better," replied the old man, "I shall submit. But I warn you openly it shall not be without a struggle." "You are old," said the Prince, "but years are disgraceful to the wicked. Your age is more unwise than the youth of others. Do not provoke me, or you may find me harder than you dream. This is the first time that I have fallen across your path in anger. Take care that it be the last." With these words, motioning the clergyman to follow, Florizel left the apartment and directed his steps towards the garden gate, and the Dictator, following with a candle, gave them light, and once more undid the elaborate fastenings with which he sought to protect himself from intrusion. "Your daughter is no longer present," said the Prince, turning on the threshold. "Let me tell you that I understand your threats, and you have only to lift your hand to bring upon yourself sudden and irremediable ruin." The Dictator made no reply, but as the Prince turned his back upon him in the lamplight, he made a gesture full of menace and insane fury, and the next moment, slipping round a corner, he was running at full speed for the nearest cab stand. Here, says my Arabian, the thread of events is finally diverted from the house with the green blinds. "One more adventure," he adds, "and we have done with the Rajah's Diamond. The last link in the chain is known among the inhabitants of Baghdad by the name of The Adventure of Prince Florizel and a Detective." End of Section 7. Read by Don W. Jenkins, Rancho San Diego, California, shaggybark.blogspot.com.